She stepped off the stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting, no house in sight, just three bearded mountain men in 100 miles of wilderness. The letter had promised a home. The letter had lied. But what she found on that mountain was something no letter could have described. A love that began with a gunshot, a grave, and 3 words from a stranger she would spend the rest of her life learning to trust. This is that story. The gunshot split the valley like a crack of thunder on a cloudless day, and Wren Whitfield threw herself behind her father's overturned wagon with a prayer caught somewhere between her teeth and her hammering heart. Dust rose around her in a pale curtain. The air smelled of black powder and blood. She pressed her spine against the splintered wood and clutched the small derringer her father had shoved into her hands, not 30 seconds before he staggered out to face the men who had stopped their wagon at the mouth of the pass. That had been 3 shots ago, maybe 4. She had lost count in the ringing that filled her ears. This was not how the journey was supposed to end. Not here in the empty belly of Wyoming territory, with the spring of 1875 still raw on the wind and the nearest settlement a full day's ride in any direction. She and her father, Edmund Whitfield, had left Boston 6 weeks earlier with everything they owned packed into this wagon. Everything that mattered, at least. 2 trunks of clothing, a crate of her father's law books, which he refused to part with even after closing his practice for good. A small wooden box containing her mother's cameo brooch, the family Bible, and a journal bound in cracked leather that Edmund kept close to his chest every night, like it was the last warm thing in the world. And now Edmund Whitfield lay in the dust 15 feet from where his daughter hid, and the stillness of his body told her everything she could not bring herself to confirm with her own eyes. 3 men moved through the wreckage of their belongings. Wren could hear them laughing. One of them kicked over a crate of books and swore at the worthlessness of the contents. Another rifled through the larger trunk, tossing aside dresses, linens, things that meant nothing to a thief, but everything to the woman who had packed them with trembling hands back in Massachusetts. A 4th man lay motionless near the front wheel. Her father's last shot had found its mark. That single act of defiance had cost Edmund everything, but it had bought his daughter a handful of seconds. Seconds she was using now to press herself so tightly against the wagon that the grain of the wood printed itself into her skin. Check for the girl. The voice was gravel and tobacco. One of them, the one she thought of as the leader, the one whose face she had glimpsed before the first shot. Dark beard, eyes like river stones, a hat pulled low. Martin swore there was a woman with the old man. Wren's breath stopped. She held the derringer in both hands and tried to steady the shaking that had taken over her entire body from the wrists down. The gun was small, almost a toy, compared to the rifles the bandits carried. 2 shots. Her father had shown her how to use it on the second night of their journey, standing by a creek bed in Missouri, aiming at a tin can balanced on a rock. She had hit the can once out of 6 tries. Edmund had smiled and said that was good enough for close range. Close range. She thought of those 2 words now and felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had seconds to decide. The tall grass beyond the wagon stretched toward a low ridge, perhaps 200 yards away. If she could reach it, she could disappear into the terrain. If she ran now while they were busy with the luggage, she might have a chance. Wren gathered her navy blue traveling dress in both fists and tensed her legs to spring. And then a whistle pierced the air. Not human. A signal of some kind, sharp and carrying the sound a hawk might make if a hawk had business with the ground. The bandits froze. Every one of them stopped what they were doing and turned toward the north. "Someone's coming," one of them hissed. Wren risked a glance upward. A plume of dust moved along the ridge, closing fast from the north. A rider. One rider alone, and yet the sight of that single approaching figure was enough to change the arithmetic of the moment entirely. "Let's go," the leader barked. He grabbed a handful of coins from the cash box they had pried open and stuffed them into his saddlebag. "We got what we came for." The 3 surviving bandits mounted their horses and spurred south without a backward glance. They left behind the body of their fallen companion, the scattered remains of the Whitfield family's worldly possessions, and a young woman who could not stop shaking behind an overturned wagon in the middle of nowhere. Wren did not move. She kept the derringer raised and her back to the wood and watched as the dust cloud from the south grew small and the one from the north grew large. The rider crested the hill at a full gallop. He sat low in the saddle, his form so fluid with the chestnut stallion beneath him That horse and man appeared to be a single creature, born of dust and motion. A worn Stetson cast deep shadow across his face. She could make out broad shoulders, a frame that seemed too large for ordinary men, and the unmistakable shape of a Winchester rifle balanced across the pommel of his saddle. He slowed as he approached, pulling the stallion from gallop to canter, to walk in a series of smooth transitions that spoke of years spent communicating with horses through pressure and release rather than force. His eyes, she noticed even from a distance, were scanning the scene with the practiced efficiency of someone who had encountered violence before and knew what to look for in its aftermath. He saw the overturned wagon, the scattered belongings, the body of Edmund Whitfield still in gray in the afternoon light. And then as he drew his horse to a halt 20 yards from the wreck, he saw the movement behind the wagon, the flash of honey blonde hair, the pale oval of a face turned toward him with eyes too wide and too blue for a man to forget in a single lifetime. He dismounted in one motion. His boots touched the ground with surprising lightness for a man of his size, and Wren realized with a start that he was one of the tallest human beings she had ever seen. 6.5 feet at least, with shoulders that could have served as the crossbeam of a doorframe. He wore a leather vest over a cotton shirt, dark denim trousers worn pale at the knees, and a red bandana knotted loosely at his throat. His hands were enormous and roughened, the knuckles scarred the fingers thick with callus. A Colt revolver hung at his hip in a holster that showed the marks of daily use. Before we go any further, I want to say something. If you are new to this channel, take a moment to subscribe. I share new frontier stories every single week, and if you are listening tonight while the world is quiet around you, drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from. I would love to know. Now, let me tell you what happened next. "You can come out," the stranger called. His voice was deep, not loud, but it carried the weight a voice carries in open country, traveling clean through still air. "They're gone now." Wren did not come out. "I am not going to hurt you, ma'am." He removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair that fell to his collar in unruly waves, sun-streaked at the temples. His face was hard-lined and weathered, a face that had spent years squinting against wind and sun and cold, with a strong jaw shadowed by 2 days of stubble and a small scar that notched his right eyebrow. But his eyes, amber and clear as creek water over gold stone, held something that did not match the rest of him. Something careful, something almost gentle. "But if you run," he added, his voice dropping quieter, "you won't make it far. Not out here. Not alone." Wren knew he was right. She had known it from the moment the bandits fled. Without a horse, without provisions, without so much as a compass or a canteen, she would be dead by nightfall. The Wyoming wilderness did not negotiate with the unprepared. It simply took what it was owed. Slowly, Wren Whitfield rose from behind the overturned wagon. She stood to her full height, which was not much, 5 feet and 3 inches in her traveling boots. She weighed perhaps 110 pounds, including the dust that caked her dress and the blood that had dried in the creases of her palms. Her father's blood. She pointed the derringer directly at the stranger's chest. "That is far enough," she said, and she was proud that her voice came out level and clear despite the tremor in her wrists. The stranger stopped. He raised both hands slightly, palms open, fingers spread. His expression did not change. He did not seem surprised to have a gun pointed at him, nor particularly alarmed. He looked at her the way a man looks at a cornered animal he means no harm to, but knows better than to approach without caution. "You are right to be careful," he said. "Who are you, boy?" Wren demanded. "Me, it is Josiah Hawthorne. Most folks just call me Josiah." The name struck her like a stone dropped into still water. Hawthorne, the name from the letters, the name she had traveled 2,000 miles to meet. E. Hawthorne, the signature had read in handwriting that was elegant and warm, and nothing at all like the rough-hewn man standing before her now. Was this him? Was this the man who had written to her about loneliness and mountains and the ache of building a life with no one to share it? She did not let the shock show on her face. Not yet. She was not ready to give this stranger, whoever he truly was, any information about herself until she understood the situation more clearly. "What do you want?" she asked. His eyes moved past her, settling on the body of Edmund Whitfield. They stayed there for a long moment, and Wren saw something shift in his face. The hardness did not leave, but something layered beneath it. Compassion, perhaps. Or recognition. the look of a man who has seen death before and has not yet found a way to make peace with it. He looked back at her. Right now, I want to help you bury your dead and get you somewhere safe before those men decide to come back. Wren's arms wavered. The derringer, which weighed less than a pound, had become impossibly heavy. Her shoulders burned, her fingers ached. And beneath all the fear and the adrenaline and the desperate need to maintain control, grief was rising like floodwater behind a dam that was already cracking. I don't even know you, she said, and her voice broke on the last word despite every effort to hold it together. The stranger looked at her. His gaze held hers across the distance between them, and something in it, something steady and unhurried and patient, cut through the panic like a blade through rope. You don't have to, Josiah Hawthorne said quietly. A small, sad smile touched the corner of his mouth. Yet, for reasons Wren could not explain then, and would spend years trying to understand later, those 3 words were enough. Not enough to trust him. Not enough to lower her guard entirely, but enough to lower the gun. She let the derringer fall to her side. My father, she said, glancing back at the still form of Edmund Whitfield. Her voice was barely a whisper now. I will help you lay him to rest proper, Josiah promised, but first we should move away from the road. Those men might have friends. Wren nodded. It was the first time she had agreed with anything anyone had said in what felt like a very long time. Josiah approached slowly. His movements were deliberate and unhurried, like a man approaching a horse that has been spooked and might bolt at any sudden gesture. He kept his hands visible. He did not reach for her. He simply walked to the overturned wagon and assessed the damage with a practiced eye. Is there anything you need from here? He asked. Wren thought of the small trunk, the one that held her mother's cameo brooch, the family Bible, with its thick leather cover and gold-edged pages, her father's journal, and the few remaining tokens of the life she had left behind in Boston. Yes, she said, a trunk, my personal belongings. Josiah nodded. He moved to the wagon and with arms that seemed to operate on a different scale than the arms of ordinary men, righted the smaller trunk and checked its contents. Clothing, a Bible, a journal, a small velvet pouch that he did not open. This one, she nodded. I will secure it to my horse. He lifted the trunk as if it weighed no more than a sack of flour. Can you ride? My father taught me, Wren answered, when I was small. Good. We will ride double until I can find you a mount. While Josiah strapped the trunk to his saddle with lengths of rawhide, Wren walked to where her father lay. She had been avoiding this. She had been avoiding it the way you avoid touching a wound that you know will not stop bleeding once you acknowledge it exists. Edmund Whitfield's face was peaceful. That was the worst part. His eyes were open, and they still held the ghost of the expression he had worn when he pushed her behind the wagon and said in a voice she would hear in her dreams for the rest of her life, hide, Wren, hide, and do not come out until it's safe. She knelt beside him. She closed his eyes with fingers that shook so badly she had to try twice. The skin was still warm, and that detail was the one that finally broke the dam. I'm sorry, Papa, she whispered. I will get there. I will get to where you planned for us. I promise. Josiah appeared beside her with a folded blanket. His own blanket, she realized. The only one he carried. We need to wrap him, he said, his voice gentle in a way that seemed almost foreign, coming from such a large and weathered man. Together in silence, they prepared Edmund Whitfield's body. Josiah did most of the lifting. Wren did most of the arranging, smoothing her father's collar, folding his hands across his chest, tucking the edges of the blanket as if she were putting a child to bed. It was the last thing she would ever do for him, and she did it with the kind of care that does not require thought because it lives in the body rather than the mind. Josiah dug the grave beneath a solitary elm tree. It was the only tree for miles in any direction, a stubborn survivor standing alone on the rolling prairie, and Wren chose it because she wanted her father to rest beneath something living. She watched the stranger work. He dug with steady, powerful strokes, each thrust of the shovel driving deep into earth that resisted and then gave way. The soil was hard-packed from winter and heavy with clay, and even a man as strong as Josiah Hawthorne had to labor for it. Sweat soaked through his cotton shirt within the first quarter hour. The muscles in his back and shoulders moved beneath the fabric in patterns that spoke of years of this kind of work. Chopping, digging, lifting, building. The work that built homesteads and broke lesser men. He did not stop. He did not rest. He simply dug until the grave was deep enough to keep the coyotes from disturbing the body, and then he helped Wren lower her father into the earth. Wren recited what she could remember of the Lord's Prayer. Her voice was barely audible over the wind that swept across the prairie in long, mournful gusts. She forgot the words halfway through and simply stood in silence, her lips moving around phrases that would not come. Josiah stood beside her with his hat pressed against his chest and his head bowed. He did not speak. He did not pray, or if he did it silently. He simply stood there, a wall of quiet respect, and let Wren have her grief without trying to fill it with words. When the last shovelful of dirt had been placed, Wren felt something settle inside her. Not peace. Something harder than peace and heavier. Finality. Her father had been her last family. Her mother had died of consumption 2 years before, slowly and terribly coughing her life away in a rented room in Boston, while Wren held her hand and Edmund sat by the window, unable to watch but unable to leave. After that, it had been just the two of them, father and daughter against the world. And now it was just Wren, alone at the edge of civilization, with nothing but a trunk of memories and the kindness of a man she had known for less than an hour. Josiah fashioned a cross from broken wagon parts. He used his knife to carve the wood, working with a precision that suggested he had done this kind of thing before, and when he was finished, the cross was rough but sturdy. He hammered it into the freshly turned earth with the flat of his palm. "What was his name?" he asked. "Edmund Whitfield, born 1823. Josiah carved the letters slowly, each one cut deep enough to last through seasons of rain and wind and frost. When he finished, he folded his knife and stepped back. "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Whitfield." "Wren," she said. The correction came automatically, the way certain habits survive even the worst days. "Everyone calls me Wren." He nodded once. "We should go. Daylight is burning and we are at least 3 hours from the nearest town." Wren looked at him directly. She studied the face that could not have been much older than 32. The deep-set eyes held a weariness that spoke of years lived hard and lessons learned at a cost. The scar through his right eyebrow, a faded mark on his left shoulder visible through a tear in his shirt that looked like the path of a bullet that had come close, but not quite close enough. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Josiah's expression did not change. "Because it is what decent folks do." He offered his hand. Wren looked at it. The palm was broad and calloused, lined with scars from rope and wire, and the countless small injuries that accumulate when a man works with his hands every day of his life. It was not the hand of the man who had written those letters. She was almost sure of that now. But it was the hand of a man who knew how to build things and bury things and carry what needed carrying. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and firm and careful, and he helped her up onto the chestnut stallion with an ease that made her feel as light as a child. She settled behind him in the saddle awkwardly, at first her hands hovering near his waist without quite touching. The horse shifted beneath the additional weight and then steadied. "Hold on," Josiah instructed. Wren placed her hands at his sides. Through the thin cotton of his shirt, she could feel the warmth of his body, the hard ridge of muscle along his ribs, the steady rhythm of his breathing. He smelled of wood-smoked leather and the clean mineral scent of freshly turned earth, her father's grave still on his clothes. The horse began to move. As they rode away from the site of her world's collapse, Wren fought the tears that pressed against the back of her eyes. She could not trust this man. She did not know his heart or his intentions or the nature of the life he led. She knew only that her survival depended on him entirely, and that thought, the absolute vulnerability of it, was more frightening than the gunshots had been. The prairie opened before them in every direction, vast and golden and indifferent. The sky was enormous. The silence was enormous. And in the middle of all that enormity, two people rode a single horse toward a smudge on the horizon that might have been a town, or might have been a trick of the fading light. Wren closed her eyes. She leaned forward until her forehead rested against the broad plain of Josiah Hawthorne's back, and she let the rhythm of the horse carry her the way a river carries a leaf, without destination, without will, and with only the faintest hope that wherever the current led it would not be worse than what she had already survived. The town of Whispering Pines appeared on the horizon just as twilight bled into darkness. It was a collection of wooden buildings arranged along a single dusty street, smaller than anything Wren had imagined when she thought of towns in the West. But the glow of lanterns in the windows was the most beautiful sight she had seen since leaving Boston. Piano music drifted from a building near the end of the street. A dog barked somewhere behind a fence. The air smelled of cooking meat and horse sweat, and the particular sweetness of pine sap that Wren would come to associate with this part of the country for the rest of her life. It is not much, Josiah said, breaking the silence that had held between them for the better part of 3 hours. But Sheriff Beckett is a good man, and Dorothea Pemberton runs a clean boarding house for respectable women. Wren managed a nod against his back. She was too exhausted for words. The hours of riding had left her stiff and aching in places she did not know could ache. Her grief sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and immovable and cold. They drew looks as they rode down the main street. A woman sitting behind a man on horseback at this hour in this manner. Wren could feel the curiosity like a physical thing pressing against her from behind curtains and above porch railings. By morning, the whispers would have her married, murdered, or worse. But propriety seemed a distant luxury compared to the simple business of staying alive. Josiah guided his horse to a modest two-story building with a hand-painted sign that read, Pemberton Boarding House, in letters that were faded but legible. He dismounted first and then reached up to help Wren down. Her legs nearly buckled when they touched the ground. He caught her by the elbow, steadying her with a hand that was firm but not forceful. Easy, he murmured. You have had a hard day. Wren straightened her spine. She stepped out of his grip with a deliberateness that she hoped conveyed independence rather than ingratitude. I am fine, she insisted. They both knew it was a lie, but Josiah had the decency not to say so. He carried her trunk to the boarding house door. A bell chimed as they entered, and a woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun looked up from a ledger behind the front counter. She was stout and sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who could assess a stranger's character and financial situation in the time it took to draw a breath. Josiah Hawthorne, she said, and her tone carried the weight of long acquaintance. Did not expect to see you back so soon. Evening, Mrs. Pemberton, he replied, setting down the trunk. This is Wren Whitfield. She needs a room. Dorothea Pemberton's shrewd eyes swept over Wren's disheveled appearance. The torn hem of the navy dress, the dust, the dried blood on her hands and wrists, the tear tracks through the grime on her cheeks. The older woman's expression softened from assessment to sympathy in the space of a heartbeat. What happened? Outlaws, Josiah answered quietly. Hit her wagon on the North Road. Her father did not make it. Dorothea came around the counter and took Wren's cold hands in her own warm ones. The gesture was so sudden, so maternal, that Wren nearly broke. You poor child, Dorothea said. You will stay here tonight. I have a room ready. I cannot. Wren began, the practical reality of her situation surfacing through the fog of exhaustion. Most of our money was taken. I will cover her lodging for the week, Josiah said, and I will speak with Sheriff Beckett about what happened. Wren turned to him. Mr. Hawthorne, I cannot accept that. Just Josiah, he said, and yes, you can. You will pay it back when you are on your feet. He said it simply, the way a man states a fact about the weather or the direction of a river. Not charity, not pity, just the practical arithmetic of survival. Dorothea nodded. That is settled. Come along, Miss Whitfield. I will show you to your room and have Betsy bring up hot water for washing. Wren knew she should protest further. She should maintain some measure of independence, some barrier between herself and the obligations that accepting help from a stranger would create. But her body overruled her pride. She managed a nod toward Josiah. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything today. Something flickered in his eyes. It was there and gone so quickly she could not name it. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper that he was not yet ready to show. Get some rest, he replied. I will check on you tomorrow. As Dorothea led her up the narrow staircase, Wren glanced back. Josiah stood in the entrance, watching her go. His expression was unreadable, that particular blankness that some men use as a wall to keep the world from seeing what moves behind it. Then he settled his hat back on his head and stepped out into the night, leaving Wren with more questions than answers about the stranger who had ridden out of the dust and into the worst moment of her life with the steady certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was needed. The room was small and clean. A narrow bed, a washstand with a chip basin, a window that looked out over the main street where the lantern light made long shadows on the packed dirt below. Wren sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her hands. They were filthy. Dust had settled into every line and crease, and beneath the dust darker stains. Her father's blood. She had touched his face. She had closed his eyes. She had tucked the blanket around his body as though warmth still mattered. A knock announced a young maid with a pitcher of steaming water and a bowl of stew that smelled of beef and rosemary. Wren thanked her mechanically and waited until the door closed before she washed. The water turned brown with dust and then red with blood, and she watched the colors swirl in the basin with the detached observation of someone who has stepped outside of herself and is watching from a distance. She changed into the nightgown Dorothea had provided, but could not bring herself to eat. Instead, she opened her trunk and withdrew two items. The first was her father's journal bound in cracked brown leather and filled with his small, precise handwriting. The second was the family Bible, heavy and worn, with the names of 3 generations of Whitfields inscribed on the opening pages. Their plan had been clear: reach Silver Creek, Wyoming, meet the family that Edmund's letters had connected them to. The Hawthorns, a family of ranchers in the mountains who had placed an advertisement for a mail-order bride that had somehow found its way to a Boston newspaper and from there to Wren's hands. The letters had been beautiful. She took them from the trunk, now a small bundle tied with blue ribbon. She untied them and spread them on the quilt, reading again the words that had convinced her to travel 2,000 miles into the unknown. I write to you from the mountains of Wyoming, where the sun rises over snow-capped peaks and the valleys run green until they touch the sky. I am a rancher. My life is hard but honest. I seek a companion, not because I am lonely, though I will confess that I am, but because I believe that a life built alone is only half built. The handwriting was graceful, educated. The voice in those letters was warm and intelligent, with a dry humor that surfaced in unexpected places and a vulnerability that felt earned rather than performed. Wren had read them so many times that she could recite passages from memory. She had fallen in love with the person who wrote those words, or at least with the idea of that person, before she ever set foot outside of Massachusetts. The letters were signed E. Hawthorne. E. Hawthorne. She thought of Josiah, the rough hands, the quiet voice, the way he dug a grave without being asked and carved a dead man's name into a cross with the care of a man who understood what the gesture meant. Was he E. Hawthorne? The handwriting did not match his manner, and yet the name matched. And he had known she was headed to Silver Creek without her telling him. Something did not fit. Wren could feel it the way you feel a stone in your shoe before you can see it. Something about Josiah Hawthorne's story had a seam in it, a place where 2 versions of the truth had been stitched together imperfectly. She set the letters aside and opened her father's journal. Edmund's entries were a mix of practical notes and personal reflections. The final pages, written during the journey west, contained lines that Wren had not yet read carefully. Must reach Silver Creek before month's end. The Hawthorne arrangement is solid. Good men. Edmund's emphasis on the plural. Good men who deserve the truth as much as Wren deserves safety. Good men. Men, not man. Wren frowned. She flipped back through earlier entries looking for other references. She found one from February written in Boston before they departed. Wrote to the Hawthorns again, 3 brothers on a mountain. The eldest carries a weight no man should carry alone. If anyone can help them, it is what I have gathered. And if anyone deserves what they have built, it is Wren. 3 brothers. The words landed in her chest with the weight of revelation. 3 brothers on a mountain, not one man seeking a wife. 3. Wren closed the journal. She sat in the darkness of the unfamiliar room and felt the ground shift beneath her for the second time that day. First the gunshots and the blood and the loss of her father, and now this. The realization that the life she had been traveling toward, the one she had imagined in such careful detail during all those weeks on the road, was not the life that was waiting for her. She extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, lying on the narrow bed, Wren Whitfield allowed herself to cry. She wept silently, the way women weep when they have no one left to hear them, until exhaustion pulled her down into a sleep haunted by gunfire and dust and the memory of a stranger's eyes that seemed to hold a promise she was not sure she could trust. Morning came with the sound of wagons and voices in the particular racket of a frontier town waking up to commerce. Wren dressed in her only other clean dress, a practical navy cotton that had survived the journey intact. She braided her honey blonde hair, pinned it, and went downstairs to face whatever the day had prepared. Dorothea Pemberton greeted her with coffee so strong it could have been used to strip paint and biscuits with honey. "You look better with some sleep," the older woman said, though still pale as milk. "Thank you for your kindness," Wren replied, sipping the coffee and feeling it burn a path through her exhaustion. "Josiah stopped out early this morning," Dorothea mentioned, watching Wren over the rim of her own cup with eyes that missed nothing. "Said the sheriff has organized a posse to track those outlaws. They rode out at dawn. Josiah is leading them. Best tracker in 3 counties, that one." Wren absorbed this. The man had ridden with her for 3 hours, settled her in the boarding house, and then instead of sleeping, had gone to the sheriff to organize a pursuit, and was now leading that pursuit into the wilderness. Does he think they will catch them? Hard to say, but Josiah Hawthorne is not a man who gives up once he starts a thing. Dorothea set a small leather pouch on the table. It clinked when it landed. "He also left this for you." Wren opened it. Coins, enough to cover several days of meals and a stage ticket. "I cannot accept this." "He said you would say exactly that. Told me to tell you it is a loan, not a gift, and you can pay him back when you reach Silver Creek." Wren's eyes narrowed. How did he know I was headed to Silver Creek? Dorothea's expression became carefully neutral. "Josiah Hawthorne knows more than he lets on about most things. That is all I will say." She refilled Wren's cup. "Now, tell me about your plans." "Are you meeting someone there?" Wren explained. "The advertisement, the letters, the arrangement to become a mail-order bride for the Hawthorne family." She left out the detail from her father's journal about 3 brothers. She was not yet ready to share that particular confusion with anyone. Dorothea's face did something complicated when she heard the name Hawthorne. "The Hawthorne Ranch," she said, "up in the mountains north of Silver Creek. You know it." "Everyone knows it. Good land, strong herd. But the Hawthornes keep to themselves. Have done since they arrived about 3 years back." Dorothea paused, choosing her next words. "You should prepare yourself, child. Life up in those mountains is not like what people write in letters." The warning was vague but unmistakable. Wren noted it and did not press further. She had enough uncertainty already without borrowing more. Dorothea told her the stage to Silver Creek ran twice a week. The next one departed tomorrow morning. That gave Wren 1 day in Whispering Pines. She spent the morning at the general store, selecting necessities with the careful attention of a woman counting every penny. The store owner, an enormous man named Henderson with a magnificent set of whiskers, confirmed what Dorothea had told her about the Hawthorne Ranch. "Run about 5,000 head of cattle," he said, wrapping a package of dried goods. "3 brothers work it together, keep mostly to themselves, but never cause any trouble. If you are expected there, you will be well situated." 3 brothers. Again. Wren filed the information away and paid for her purchases. She was arranging to have her supplies delivered to the boarding house when she stepped outside, and her eye caught something on the community notice board beside the boarding house entrance. A poster, a crude drawing of a man's face beneath heavy black letters. "Wanted, dead or alive." The name printed beneath the drawing was unmistakable. Josiah Hawthorne. Wren stared. The drawing bore only a passing resemblance to the man who had saved her, but the physical description matched with terrible precision. Height over 6 feet, amber eyes, scar through the right eyebrow. The bounty was $500. The charges were armed robbery and murder in Colorado territory. Her hands went cold. The same hands that Josiah had held to help her onto his horse. The same hands he had steadied at her elbow when her legs buckled. The man who had dug her father's grave, who had given up his own blanket to cover the body, who had ridden through the night to organize a posse, was wanted for murder. She reached for the poster. She was going to tear it down. She was not sure why. Some instinct that she would later have difficulty explaining. "I would not do that if I were you." Sheriff Amos Beckett stood a few feet away. He was a lean man in his 50s with a weathered face, a silver mustache, and the quiet authority of someone who has spent decades separating the guilty from the unlucky. "That is official business," he said, nodding at the poster. Wren's hand stopped. "This man," she said carefully, "is he truly wanted?" The sheriff stepped closer and studied the poster as though seeing it for the first time, though it had clearly been hanging there for months. Depends on who you ask. Some say Josiah Hawthorne is a cold-blooded killer. Others say he was set up by a corrupt judge in Colorado. He glanced at Wren. I take it you have met our local mystery man. He saved my life yesterday, Wren admitted. Helped bury my father after the outlaws attacked our wagon. Amos Beckett nodded slowly. That sounds like the Josiah Hawthorne I know. Been in these parts about 3 years, keeps to himself. Works harder than any man I have seen. Never caused a moment of trouble. He tapped the poster. I have had this for over a year. Could have arrested him any time. Why have you not? The sheriff's face creased into something that was not quite a smile, but carried the ghost of one. Because I have my doubts about what happened in Colorado. And because in 3 years, Josiah Hawthorne has done more good in this territory than most men do in a lifetime. He fixed Wren with a look that was both kind and shrewd, including saving your life by the sound of it. Wren looked down the street in the direction Josiah had disappeared that morning. Who is he really? That, said Sheriff Amos Beckett, tipping his hat, is something you will have to ask him yourself. But I will tell you this. Whatever Josiah Hawthorne did or did not do in his past, he is a man I would trust with my life in the present. Good day, Miss Whitfield. Wren entered the boarding house. She climbed the stairs. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall while two truths wrestled inside her. The man who had saved her, who had treated her with nothing but respect and gentleness, when she was at her most vulnerable, was wanted for murder. And the sheriff, whose entire purpose was to enforce the law, trusted him without reservation. She was still sitting there when the supper bell rang. That evening, after a communal dinner she barely tasted, Wren stepped onto the small back porch of the boarding house. The night sky was vast and clear, scattered with more stars than she had ever seen in Boston. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs, but clean in a way that made each breath feel like the first one taken after a long illness. Beautiful night. His voice came from the shadows, and she startled, but she did not retreat. Josiah stepped into the dim light that spilled from the kitchen window. He was leaning against the porch railing at a distance that was carefully, deliberately respectful. Yes, she agreed after a moment. We do not see stars like this in Boston. Is that home for you? It was. Not anymore. They stood in silence. Somewhere down the street, the piano was playing again. A dog barked. The windmill at the edge of town creaked and turned. I saw the wanted poster, Wren said. She had decided that directness was the only approach that made sense. With your name on it. Josiah did not seem surprised. He nodded slowly, his profile illuminated by the faint light. I wondered if you would. Are you going to deny it? No. Did you do what they say, rob that bank, kill those men? Josiah met her gaze. In the half-light, his eyes were darker, deeper like the surface of water that conceals its depth. I was there for the robbery, he said. I will not deny that, but I did not kill anyone. I never fired my weapon. Then why are you wanted for murder? Because the judge's son was the real killer, and I was convenient. His voice was flat, controlled. Not bitter, simply factual, the way a man describes weather he cannot change. Wrong place, wrong time. Made a good scapegoat. Sheriff Beckett seems to believe you. A ghost of a smile crossed Josiah's face. Beckett is a good judge of character. And what am I supposed to make of your character, Mr. Hawthorne? Wren heard herself ask and was surprised by her own boldness. That is not for me to say, he replied. But I hope you know I mean you no harm. Never did. Never will. Wren studied him in the fading light. Every rational part of her mind said to be wary of this man with his mysterious past and the price on his head. But something else, something deeper than reason, something that lived in the same place that had told her to lower the gun that afternoon, trusted him. The stage leaves at 8 tomorrow morning, she said at last. Josiah nodded. I know. I am going to Silver Creek, to the Hawthorne Ranch. Something moved across his face. She could not read it in the darkness, but she felt it. A shift. A tightening. I know that too. How? He was quiet for a moment. Then your father told me. Wren went still. My father was dead when you arrived. He was not quite gone, Josiah said, and his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. He had just enough breath left to ask me to help his daughter get to Silver Creek. to get her to the Hawthorne place. He paused. Those were his last words. The revelation hit Wren with a force that made the porch seem to tilt beneath her feet. Her father had not died instantly. He had lived long enough to speak to this stranger, long enough to use his final breath not for a prayer or a farewell, but for a practical instruction. Get my daughter where she needs to go. That was Edmund Whitfield, practical to the very end. He did not suffer long, Josiah said, reading her expression with an accuracy that unnerved her. Just long enough to know you were safe. Wren nodded. She could not speak. The grief that she had managed to contain all day was pressing against her chest with a force that made breathing difficult. Will I see you again, she asked. She had not planned to ask that. The words simply arrived. Something crossed Josiah's face that might have been pain or hope or some combination of the two that does not have a name. I am riding out tonight, he said. Work waiting for me north of here. I see. Wren was surprised by the weight of the disappointment that settled over her. Then this is goodbye. It is. He hesitated. Then he added quietly, I hope you find what you were looking for up there. Wren turned toward the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. Thank you, Josiah, for everything. She went inside. She climbed the stairs to her room. And as she lay in the narrow bed watching the shadows of the wind move across the ceiling, she thought about a man who dug graves for strangers and gave away his only blanket and rode through the night for people who had done nothing to deserve his help. She thought about the word yet, and she thought for the first time since her mother's death that perhaps the world was not finished with her, that perhaps the worst day of her life was also the first day of something she could not yet see, but was already moving toward with the same inevitability as the chestnut stallion that had carried her through the dust of a dying afternoon toward a town full of lanterns and a future she had not imagined. Tomorrow she would board the stage to Silver Creek. She would travel 3 days across rough country, and at the end of that journey she would find a ranch on a mountain and 3 brothers whose names she already knew and whose lives were tangled with hers in ways she was only beginning to understand. But tonight she slept, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not dream of loss. She dreamed of mountains. The stage to Silver Creek was everything Josiah had warned it would be, and several things he had not mentioned, because no amount of warning could prepare a person for 3 days of being jolted across rutted roads in a wooden box on wheels. Wren wedged herself between the coach wall and a cattle buyer from Cheyenne named Garrett Simmons, whose wife Pearl sat opposite and spent the long hours sharing food from a basket and stories about her children back east. They were decent people, the Simmonses, the kind of people who filled silence with warmth rather than noise, and Wren was grateful for them in ways she could not have expressed without her voice breaking. The spring rains had turned sections of the trail to mud, thick enough to swallow a wheel. Twice the passengers had to disembark and walk while the driver coaxed the team through stretches where the road had become a river of brown slurry. Wren's navy dress was ruined by the second day. She stopped caring by the third. On the final afternoon, as the coach crested a long hill and Silver Creek appeared in the valley below, Garrett Simmons cleared his throat and said something that had clearly been sitting on his tongue for miles. The Hawthorne place. You said you were heading there. Yes, Wren confirmed. Fine outfit, strong herd, but you should know. He glanced at his wife, who gave a small nod. There are 3 of them. Brothers. They keep to themselves. I am aware, Wren said, and the steadiness of her own voice surprised her. Garrett studied her face for a moment, then nodded with the quiet approval of a man who respects someone who walks into a situation with open eyes. Well, you seem like a woman who can handle herself. Silver Creek was larger than Whispering Pines, a proper main street lined with 2-story buildings, many of brick rather than wood. A bank, a land office, 3 saloons and a church with a white steeple that caught the last of the daylight like a finger pointing toward heaven. Wren counted the buildings the way a soldier counts the features of unfamiliar terrain, looking for exits and advantages, and places to take shelter if the need arose. The Simmonses insisted she stay the night at the Silver Creek Hotel as their guests. Pearl pressed a wrapped biscuit into her hand at breakfast the next morning and said, "You write to us if you need anything you hear." Wren promised she would and meant it. Then she hired a wagon and driver to take her the 5 miles north to the Hawthorne Ranch. The road climbed steadily from the valley floor into the foothills, winding through grassland, dotted with spring wildflowers, and stands of cottonwood that lined the creeks. The air changed as they gained elevation. Cooler, thinner, carrying the scent of pine and snowmelt from the peaks that now dominated the western horizon. When the wagon topped the final rise, Wren saw the ranch for the first time and understood immediately that this place had not been built to impress anyone. It had been built to last. A large cabin of whole logs, the bark still visible on some of the timbers, sat in a natural bowl of land protected by rock walls on three sides. The roof was stone. The chimney was granite mortared by hand, and smoke rose from it in a thin gray line that meant someone was home. A barn stood to the east, twice the size of the cabin, with a corral attached where horses moved in the lazy patterns of animals that have been well fed and know it. Split rail fences ran in long, straight lines toward the base of the mountains, enclosing pastures where cattle grazed in clusters of brown and white. There was no paint, no decoration, no attempt at beauty for its own sake. And yet it was beautiful the way a well-made tool is beautiful, or a bridge that carries weight without complaint. Every log had been chosen and placed by someone who understood that the difference between a house that stands and a house that falls is measured in the care taken with each joint and beam. The wagon stopped at the gate. Wren stepped down her trunk at her feet and looked up at the cabin porch. Three men stood there. The first thing she registered was their size. All three were tall in this way that certain families produce tall men, as if the bones themselves had been forged on a larger scale. But they were not identical. They were variations on a theme, the same raw material shaped by different hands. The one in the center was Josiah. She recognized him instantly, even at 40 yards by the set of his shoulders, and the particular stillness with which he held himself. He wore his leather vest over a work shirt, his hat pushed back, and his expression, as he looked down at her from the porch, was not surprise exactly because he had known she would come eventually. Her father's dying words had told him that much. But the look on his face was the look of a man who had been bracing for an earthquake and still was not ready when the ground moved. He had known she was coming. He had not known what it would feel like to see her standing at his gate. The one on the left was slightly shorter than Josiah, but still well over 6 feet. He had chestnut brown hair that waved at his collar and green eyes that held a warmth she could feel even from this distance. His face was handsome in a gentler way than Josiah's, the jaw less severe, the mouth readier to smile. He had dimples. Wren noticed them because he was already smiling, though whether from welcome or nervousness she could not tell. His hands were large, but his fingers were long, and something about them suggested a man who was as comfortable with a pen as with a hammer. The one on the right was the youngest and the most unsettling. He was perhaps 6'2", compact and coiled with the kind of energy that certain men carry like a loaded spring. His hair was auburn red and wild, his jaw sharp, his hazel eyes lit with something that Wren could only describe as challenge. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest and his weight shifted to one hip, and he looked at Wren the way a man looks at a problem he did not ask for and does not intend to solve. Wren stood at the gate. The wind moved through the valley and pressed her ruined dress against her legs. She was dirty, exhausted, grieving, and approximately 2,000 miles from anything she understood. And she was looking up at three mountain men who were looking down at her with three entirely different expressions on three faces that shared the same strong bones and stubborn jaw. The one with the warm smile spoke first. He came down the porch steps with an eagerness that the other two did not share, his voice carrying the same gentle cadence that Wren recognized from somewhere she could not immediately place. "Miss Whitfield?" he asked, and then she placed it. The letters. That warmth, that careful kindness, that way of making a person feel seen. It was not Josiah's voice, but it was the voice that matched the handwriting. The voice of the man who had written to her about loneliness and mountains, and the belief that a life built alone was only half built. "I am Emmett Hawthorne," he said, "and these are my brothers." Wren looked at Josiah on the porch. His gaze locked on hers, and in it, she read something that confirmed what she had suspected since the first night in Whispering Pines. He had not written those letters. He had not placed the advertisement. And whatever turmoil was moving behind those steady eyes, it was the turmoil of a man whose carefully ordered world had just been rearranged by his own brother without his consent. "You had better come inside," Josiah said. His voice was flat and controlled in a way that suggested significant effort. The cabin's main room was large and rough and smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, and coffee that had been sitting on the stove too long. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. The furniture was handmade heavy functional, a long table of rough-hewn pine, chairs built for men of considerable size, shelves lined with tools, rope-tin cups, and Wren noticed with a start a small row of books. Emmett pulled out a chair for her at the table. Josiah remained standing by the fireplace, arms folded across his chest in a posture that mirrored the youngest brother's so precisely that Wren realized it was a family habit. The youngest, who had not yet been introduced, leaned against the far wall and watched proceedings with the focused attention of a man expecting an ambush. "I think," Wren said, sitting down and folding her hands on the table with a composure that cost her more than anyone in the room would ever know, "that someone owes me an explanation." Emmett sat across from her. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at Josiah, who did not look back, and then at the youngest brother, who shrugged with a hostility that was almost theatrical. "I placed the advertisement," Emmett said. "4 months ago. I wrote the letters. All of them, under the name E. Hawthorne." Silence filled the cabin. It was a particular kind of silence, the kind that occurs when several people are thinking very loud thoughts, and none of them want to go first. "You used my initial," Josiah said from the fireplace. His voice was quiet, but the words had edges. "I used the family initial. It could have been any of us. It could not have been any of us, because none of us agreed to this. That is exactly why I did it without asking." Emmett's voice rose for the first time, losing its gentleness. "Because you would have said no. You would have said we do not need anyone. You would have said we are fine the way we are. And that is a lie, Josiah. We are 3 men living on a mountain, eating burned food and talking to horses because there is no one else to talk to." "I do not talk to the horses," Josiah said. "You talk to Ranger every single night before bed. Ranger is a good listener. The point," Emmett pressed, "is that I saw what this family needed and I acted. I am sorry I did it behind your back, but I am not sorry I did it." The youngest brother pushed off the wall. "Name is Silas, since nobody bothered with introductions, and nobody asked me about any of this." His voice was rougher than his brother's, carrying the rasp of a man who used it more for shouting than for conversation. He took 2 steps toward Wren. He was not as tall as Josiah, but he moved with a coiled energy that made the room feel smaller. His auburn hair fell across his forehead, and his hazel eyes burned with something that was not quite anger. It was closer to fear, Wren realized. The particular fear of a man whose world is small enough to control and who sees a stranger as a threat to that control. "We do not need a woman from Boston telling us how to live," Silas said, and the word Boston came out of his mouth the way some people say the word rattlesnake. "You will last a week up here, maybe 2, and then you will run back east crying about the cold and the dirt and the lack of whatever it is Eastern women cannot live without, and we will be right back where we started, except now the whole territory will be laughing at us." Wren looked at Silas Hawthorne. She looked at him the way she had looked at the bandits' dust trail, the wanted poster, and the endless prairie beyond her father's grave. She looked at him as a woman who had lost everything she loved in the span of a single afternoon and had not yet finished deciding what she was willing to lose next. "3 months ago," she said, her voice level, "I received letters from someone in this family, letters that described this mountain, this life, the desire for companionship. I believed those letters. My father believed them. My father gave his life on the road bringing me here." The room went very still. "I did not come to be pitied. I did not come to be rescued. And I certainly did not come to be insulted by a man who has known me for less than 5 minutes." She looked at each of them in turn. Emmett pale with guilt, Silas rigid with defiance, Josiah unreadable as stone. "If I stay here, it will be on my terms. I am a guest, not a wife, not a servant, a guest until I decide otherwise. I want a room with a lock on the inside. I want to be treated with the same respect I intend to show each of you. And I want honesty. No more secrets. No more letters written under borrowed names." The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges the furniture of people's expectations. Josiah spoke first. "You will have the bedroom. Lock on the inside. I will sleep in the barn loft. Emmett and Silas keep their room." He looked at his brothers with an expression that did not invite debate. "She cooks, we provide the food. Beyond that, nobody owes anybody anything." Emmett nodded immediately, a relief softening his features. Silas held out for 3 long seconds, his jaw working, his eyes fixed on some invisible point above Wren's head. Then he gave a single sharp nod and walked out the door without another word. They heard his boots on the porch, then the crunch of gravel, then the barn door opening and closing with more force than was strictly necessary. "He will come around," Emmett said, though his expression suggested he was not entirely sure. "I do not need him to come around," Wren replied. "I need him to be civil. There is a difference." That night, alone in the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, Wren sat on a bed that was too large for her and too roughly made for comfort and listened to the sounds of the mountain. Wind through pine trees, the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night, the creak of the barn where Josiah had gone without complaint, giving up his own bed for a woman he had not invited and had every reason to resent. She locked the door. She set the derringer on the bedside table. And she opened the family Bible, turning past the generations of Whitfield names to the back cover where her fingers found something she had not noticed before. A slight thickness. A place where the leather was stiffer than it should have been, as if something had been sewn between the layers. She did not investigate further. Not tonight. Tonight she was too tired, too raw, too full of questions that had no answers. She placed the Bible beside the gun and lay down in the darkness. Somewhere outside, she heard the low murmur of Josiah's voice from the barn. She could not make out the words. She supposed he was talking to his horse. The thought made something in her chest loosen, by a fraction some knot she had been carrying so tightly she had forgotten it was there. She left the latch undone when she finally lay down to sleep. She was not sure what it meant, but she thought maybe he would understand. The first week passed in a rhythm that Wren learned by watching. The Hawthorne brothers lived by a schedule that was dictated not by clocks but by light and weather, and the needs of 5,000 head of cattle spread across 15,000 acres of mountain pasture. Josiah rose before dawn. Every morning in the gray half-light, Wren heard the cabin door open and close with the quiet precision of a man who has practiced being silent. By the time she came downstairs, the fire in the kitchen stove was already lit. The coffee was already hot, and a cup had been placed on the table nearest the chair she had chosen on her first morning. He never mentioned this. She never asked. It simply happened as reliable as the sunrise that followed it. Emmett was the center of the household in ways that the other two brothers were not. He cooked, he cleaned, he maintained the supplies, and made the trips to Silver Creek for provisions. He was the one who showed Wren around the property on her second day, walking her through the barn, where 3 horses stood in well-kept stalls, the smokehouse where meat hung in dark strips, the root cellar stocked with potatoes and preserves, and the workshop where tools hung in neat rows on peg boards. "Josiah built all of this?" Wren asked, running her hand along a fence rail that had been sanded smooth. "Every log, every nail, 3 years of work." Emmett paused at the corral and leaned on the top rail. "When we came here, there was nothing, just land and trees and a creek. Josiah looked at it and saw a ranch. Silas and I looked at it and saw a lot of work." He smiled. "We were both right." Silas existed on the periphery of Wren's first days like a weather system that could be tracked but not predicted. He ate his meals at the far end of the table, spoke only when addressed, and directed his communications almost exclusively to the horses. The one time Wren attempted to ask him about the cattle operation, he looked at her with an expression of such thorough disinterest that she felt the temperature in the room drop by several degrees. But she noticed things. She noticed that the woodpile beside the kitchen stove, which she used for cooking, was always full, though she never saw anyone fill it. She noticed that a pair of riding boots appeared outside her bedroom door on the third morning, worn, but well-oiled, size close enough to her feet that they could not have been left there by accident. And she noticed that when a coyote came too close to the hen house on her 5th night, it was Silas who was up and out the door with a rifle before either of his brothers had reached the porch. He did not do these things for her. He would have denied it if asked. He did them because the ranch required them, and because beneath the bristle and the bluster, Silas Hawthorne was a man who took care of what was his, whether he wanted to or not. The turning point with Silas came on the 8th day. He was in the corral with a young horse, a mare that had been brought in from the mountain and had not yet decided whether the humans who had captured her were worth trusting. The mare was panicking, throwing her head, kicking at the fence rails. Silas held the lead rope, but the animal was stronger than he expected, and when she reared, the rope burned through his hands and the mare bolted To the far side of the corral sides, heaving eyes rolling white, Wren was watching from the porch. She had been mending a shirt of Emmett's, a task she had volunteered for because idle hands made her feel like a burden. When the mare reared, Wren set down the shirt and walked to the fence. "Stay back," Silas ordered. Wren did not stay back. She climbed onto the lowest rail and began to sing. It was a lullaby, something her grandmother had sung to horses on her grandfather's farm in Maryland. A simple melody with no particular words, just sounds gentle and rhythmic and low. The kind of sound that enters the body through the chest rather than the ears. The mare's ears swiveled toward her. The rolling eyes steadied. The heaving sides slowed. One hesitant step, then another, and then the mare was walking toward Wren's outstretched hand with the cautious curiosity of an animal that has decided to give trust one more chance. Silas stood in the middle of the corral with the burned rope still in his hands, watching a woman who weighed half what he did accomplish in 2 minutes, what he had failed to do in 3 days. "My grandfather raised carriage horses in Maryland," Wren said, not looking at Silas, her attention still on the mare's soft muzzle. "I spent summers there before he passed." Silas did not apologize. He did not compliment her. He looked at the mare, then at Wren, then at his own burned palms. He picked up the lead rope and walked to the barn without a word. But the next morning at breakfast, he called her Wren instead of nothing at all, and he passed her the biscuits before she asked. It was Emmett who arranged the meeting that changed the shape of Wren's life on the mountain. 2 weeks into her stay, he drove her to a neighboring ranch 5 miles to the east, the largest spread in the valley, owned by a man named Cornelius Ashford. Cornelius was in his 60s, silver-haired and barrel-chested, with a handshake that could crack walnuts and a voice that carried the deep bass resonance of a church organ. He had been ranching in Wyoming for 30 years and had watched the Hawthorne brothers build their operation with the approving eye of a man who recognized his own stubbornness in younger men. "Josiah Hawthorne," Cornelius said, settling into a rocking chair on his wider front porch, "rode into this valley with nothing but 2 brothers, 3 horses, and a look in his eye that said he would build something here or die trying. I have seen a lot of men come to these mountains. Most of them leave. The ones who stay are the ones worth knowing." His daughter Nell appeared with a tray of lemonade and an expression of frank curiosity. She was 23, brown-haired, straight-backed, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from growing up in a place where competence matters more than convention. She wore men's trousers under a split skirt. Her boots were scuffed to the color of old dust, and she shook Wren's hand with a grip that would have done credit to a blacksmith. "So you are the mail-order bride," Nell said. It was not a question, and it was not a judgment. It was simply a statement of fact delivered with a directness that Wren would come to recognize as Nell Ashford's defining characteristic. "I am not sure what I am yet," Wren admitted. "Fair enough." Nell sat down on the porch rail and regarded Wren with eyes that were green and sharp and thoroughly amused. "But I can tell you what you are not. You are not the first woman to come to these mountains expecting one thing and finding another. And you will not be the last." Nell became Wren's friend. Not gradually the way friendships usually form, with cautious exchanges of personal information and careful testing of boundaries, but all at once the way a match becomes a fire when it finds the right kindling. Nell taught Wren to saddle a horse properly for mountain terrain. She lent her practical clothing. She showed her how to preserve meat and identify the tracks of animals that might threaten the livestock. She provided context for the world Wren had entered, translating the unspoken codes of frontier life into language an Eastern woman could understand. And she told Wren with the casual authority of someone who had been watching from a distance what the rest of the valley already knew. "He looks at you," Nell said one afternoon, as they rode the fence line between the Ashford and Hawthorne properties, "when you are not paying attention. I have lived next to Josiah Hawthorne for 3 years. I have never seen him look at anything the way he looks at you." Wren adjusted her reins and said nothing. The wind pushed her hair across her face, and she let it grateful for the curtain. Inside the Hawthorne cabin, the days took on a texture that Wren had not expected. She had imagined frontier life as a kind of extended hardship, an endurance test measured in cold mornings, in hard labor, in the absence of everything she had known. And it was those things. But it was also something else. It was the smell of coffee before dawn and the way the first light came through the cabin windows in long golden bars that turned the dust motes into constellations. It was the sound of Emmett humming a Missouri folk song while he kneaded bread dough. It was the particular satisfaction of entering numbers into the account ledger she had reorganized, and seeing in neat columns the evidence that the ranch was profitable and that her work had made it more so. It was evenings by the fire when the four of them occupied the same room in a silence that grew less awkward with each passing day. Josiah in his chair by the hearth reading. Always reading. Shakespeare and the Bible, and a worn copy of something by a man named Thoreau that he handled with the care most men reserved for loaded firearms. Emmett at the table writing in a journal or composing what Wren suspected were letters to someone in town. Silas on the floor near the door cleaning a rifle or braiding a new halter for the mare, his rough hands capable of a delicacy that contradicted everything else about him. And Wren in the chair nearest the lamp, mending or reading, or simply sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the fire feeling something she had not felt since before her mother's death. Not happiness exactly, something quieter, a sense of being in the right place, of fitting however improbably into a space she had not known existed. It was in the 5th week that Wren attempted her first solo supper. She had been studying Emmett's mother's cookbook, a handwritten volume that Josiah had left beside the wash basin one evening without comment or explanation. The recipes were simple and practical, annotated in a woman's neat hand with notes that made Wren smile despite herself. Josiah likes extra potatoes. Silas cannot eat tree nuts. Emmett prefers Sunday biscuits with honey. She chose a beef stew. She followed the recipe precisely. She did everything right except the timing, and the result was a pot of liquid in which overcooked beef and undercooked potatoes floated in a broth, the color and consistency of dishwater topped with onions that had passed through black to something approaching geological. Silas looked at his bowl, looked at Wren, pushed the bowl away, left the table. The door closed behind him with a controlled firmness that was somehow worse than a slam. Emmett ate everything in his bowl with the quiet heroism of a man walking knowingly into cannon fire. He smiled. It was not convincing. Josiah ate 2 full servings. His face remained perfectly neutral throughout. When he finished, he set his spoon down and said, "Needs salt." Then he rose and went out to the barn. Wren stood at the wash basin afterwards, scrubbing the pot with lye soap and fighting back tears that she refused to attribute to stew. A hand placed something on the counter beside her. She looked up. Josiah stood there, having come back from the barn for no apparent reason, and on the counter lay a small bunch of wildflowers, purple and yellow and white, tied with a strand of grass. He did not say anything. He did not look at her. He simply set them down and walked back out into the night. The next day, Wren asked Emmett who had been leaving flowers on her windowsill. Emmett shook his head. She asked Silas, who laughed for the first time in her presence, a short, sharp sound of genuine amusement. "I do not pick flowers," he said, and the way he said it made the idea sound as absurd as a mountain picking flowers. Wren looked out the window at Josiah, who was splitting wood in the yard with the methodical intensity of a man who used physical labor the way other men used whiskey. The axe rose and fell, the wood split clean, and Wren understood with a certainty that settled in her chest like sunlight exactly who had been leaving flowers for her every morning since the day she arrived. A week later, she found Josiah in the barn at dusk, trying to wrap a cut on his left hand with his right. The gash was deep earned from a fencing wire that had snapped under tension, and the bandage kept slipping because a man cannot effectively bandage his own dominant hand. Wren did not ask permission. She took the cloth from him, sat on the milking stool opposite, and pulled his hand into her lap. His hand was enormous in hers, calloused and scarred and warm. She cleaned the wound with water from the horse trough and wrapped it with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 2 years tending a dying mother and knew her way around a bandage. Josiah did not speak. He did not move. She was aware, in the way you are aware of the fire in the room even with your back turned, that he was holding his breath. "Thank you," he said when she finished. His voice was lower than usual, rougher at the edges. "It is what decent folks do," Wren replied, and the echo of his own words from their first meeting passed between them like a current. He looked at her. She looked at him. The barn was quiet except for the horses shifting in their stalls and the wind pressing against the walls. The lantern light carved shadows into the planes of his face and turned his eyes into something molten, something that seemed to contain heat and depth in equal measure. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. And in that silence, something shifted between them that was as real as the wood beneath their feet and as irreversible as the turning of the season. Wren released his hand. She stood, She walked to the barn door and paused. "Good night, Josiah." "Good night, Wren." She crossed the yard to the cabin. She climbed the stairs to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her own hands together, feeling the ghost of his calluses against her palms. That night, Wren paused at the bedroom door with her hand on the latch. She had locked it every evening since arriving, except once. Tonight, she let her hand fall away and left the latch open. It was becoming a habit, and habits she was learning were the quiet language of trust. And outside the cabin, the Wyoming stars burned in their ancient patterns above a mountain that had watched 1,000 stories begin and end within the circle of its shadow. This one, the mountain might have said, if mountains could speak, was only just beginning. Summer came to the Wyoming mountains the way summer comes to places that have earned it slowly and with a kind of stubborn generosity, as if the land itself had decided it had punished its inhabitants long enough and could afford to be kind for a few months before the cold returned. The grass in the high pastures turned from pale green to deep emerald. Wildflowers erupted across the meadows in carpets of purple and gold that stretched from the ranch gate to the tree line. The creek behind the cabin ran fast and cold with snowmelt, and in the mornings when the mist rose off the water and the sun caught it, the whole valley looked like something a man might dream about and then refuse to believe was real. Wren had been at the Hawthorne Ranch for 2 months. In that time, she had learned to start a fire in a cast-iron stove without burning herself more than twice, to keep accounts that made Josiah nod with quiet approval to ride a mountain trail on a horse named Rusty, who was neither fast nor pretty, but who never put a foot wrong on loose stone. She had earned Emmett's friendship, Silas's grudging tolerance, and something from Josiah that she did not yet have a name for, but that she felt every time he entered a room, a shift in the air, a tightening of attention, as if every nerve in her body had been recalibrated to register his presence the way a compass registers north. She had not told him about the documents in the Bible. She had discovered them 3 weeks after her arrival late one night when the sleep refused to come, and she had opened the heavy book more for comfort than for reading. Her fingers had found the thickness in the back cover, the place where something had been sewn between the leather layers. She had used a small knife to open the seam carefully the way her father would have done it, and inside she had found papers, legal documents, witness statements, a sworn affidavit from a man named Gerald Porter, identifying one Victor Crane as the person who had fired the shots that killed 2 bank employees during a robbery in Colorado Territory in 1872. A second affidavit from a woman named Sarah Meacham, who had been a clerk at the courthouse and had seen Judge Crane Victor's father order the destruction of evidence that would have exonerated Josiah Hawthorne, and a handwritten letter from her own father, Edmund Whitfield, addressed to no one in particular, that read simply, "These documents represent the truth. I was unable to present them in time. I pray that whoever finds them will have the courage to see them delivered to honest hands." Wren had sat with those papers in her lap for a very long time. She had understood then, with a clarity that was almost painful, why her father had been so insistent about this journey, why he had encouraged her to answer the advertisement, why he had kept the Bible close and told her never to let it go. Edmund Whitfield had not merely been escorting his daughter to a new life. He had been carrying evidence that could free a man he had never met from a sentence he did not deserve. And someone had killed him for it. The bandits on the road had not been random. They had been sent. By whom Wren could not yet prove, but the documents pointed in a direction that made her stomach turn. She had hidden the papers back inside the Bible and made copies painstakingly by hand over 3 nights by lamplight in her bedroom. Her father had taught her that a good lawyer always keeps the original separate from the working copy, and the habit had served her well. She said nothing to anyone. Not yet. She needed to understand the full picture before she acted. But the documents sat in her room like a second heartbeat, pulsing with possibility and danger in equal measure. Cornelius Ashford hosted the summer dance on the last Saturday of July. The big barn on the Ashford Ranch had been cleared and strung with lanterns and bunting made from flour sacks dyed in berry juice. A fiddler, a guitarist, and an accordion player from Silver Creek set up on a platform of stacked hay bales. Tables lined the walls laden with food brought by every ranch family within 30 miles. The air smelled of roasted meat, fresh bread, kerosene, and the particular sweetness of women's perfume mixed with pine and horse that defined social occasions in the Wyoming Territory. Wren wore a blue dress that Nell had helped her sew from fabric purchased in town. It was simple in cut but well made, and the color a deep cornflower blue that matched her eyes was Nell's choice. "Trust me," Nell had said, pinning the hem. "That color will stop a man in his boots." Wren had not asked which man. She had not needed to. She descended the Ashford porch steps beside Nell and entered the barn, and the noise and light and movement of 60 people gathered in a space built for cattle enveloped her like a wave. Cowboys she recognized from neighboring ranches nodded to her. Their wives offered smiles that ranged from genuine to curious to carefully neutral. Cornelius Ashford stood near the entrance greeting guests with the booming warmth of a man who considered hospitality a competitive sport. The Hawthorne brothers arrived together. Emmett came first, clean-shaven and smiling. His chestnut hair was combed for what Wren suspected was the first time in weeks. He wore a white shirt and a vest that actually matched his trousers, and he moved through the crowd with the easy sociability that was his natural element. Silas came second, looking as though the barn itself had offended him by existing. His auburn hair had been wetted and pushed back, but was already rebelling against the discipline. He wore a clean shirt, which for Silas constituted formal attire, and his expression suggested that he was calculating exactly how long he had to stay before he could leave without being rude. And then Josiah stepped through the barn door, and Wren felt the room recalibrate around him, the way a room recalibrates around a storm that has just crossed the threshold. He had shaved. The 2 days of stubble that she had come to think of as a permanent feature of his face was gone, revealing the full severity of his bone and the unexpected curve of his mouth. His dark hair was trimmed and combed. He wore a black coat over a white shirt that was clearly new, or at least saved for occasions that warranted the discomfort. He looked like a man who had been constructed for open country and hard weather and was tolerating the constraints of civilization as a personal favor to someone he cared about. His eyes found Wren across the barn. That warm, steady gaze met cornflower blue through the haze of lantern light and the movement of dancing couples and the beat of 100 conversations happening at once. He stopped walking, just for a moment, a hitch in his stride that no one else would have noticed, but that Wren felt like a hand pressed against her heart. Nell leaned close to Wren's ear. "Told you," stopped in his boots. The music shifted to a waltz. Emmett appeared at Wren's elbow with a grin that suggested he had been planning this moment for days. "You have to dance. It is practically the law at an Ashford gathering." He looked over his shoulder at Josiah, who had not moved from his position near the wall. "And my brother is a better dancer than he pretends to be. Our mother made sure of it." Wren crossed the floor. Each step felt deliberate, weighted, as though she were walking through water rather than air. She stopped in front of Josiah, who looked down at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and failing in ways that made her breath catch. "If you are willing," she said. She did not know where the boldness came from. Perhaps from the blue dress. Perhaps from 2 months of wildflowers left on windowsills and conversations spoken in silences rather than words. Perhaps from the simple truth that she was tired of circling and ready to close the distance. Josiah offered his hand. She placed her fingers in his palm, and the contact, skin against skin, callus against softness, sent something through her that was not quite electricity and not quite warmth, but existed in the space between the two, where the body knows things the mind has not yet admitted. He led her onto the floor. His hands settled at her waist, maintaining a distance that was proper and careful and maddening. They began to move with the music, and Wren discovered that Josiah Hawthorne danced the way he did everything else, with a controlled grace that made effort invisible. "You dance well for a man who lives on a mountain," she said. "My mother believed every gentleman should know how to waltz," he replied, regardless of his circumstances. "And are you a gentleman, Mr. Hawthorne?" His gaze held hers. The lantern light moved across his face in patterns of gold and shadow. "I try to be," he said, and his voice dropped lower, quieter, meant for her alone. "Especially when there is a reason to try." The music ended. They stood still for one beat too long, their hands still connected, the space between them humming with everything that had not been said across 8 weeks of shared meals and shared silences and 100 small acts of care that were not small at all. Then someone called Josiah's name from across the barn, and the moment broke, and he released her hand and stepped back with the careful formality of a man who knows that if he does not step back now, he may never step back at all. 3 days after the dance, Silas rode in from Silver Creek at a speed that turned heads. He pulled his horse up in the yard and was off the saddle before the animal had fully stopped, his face flushed with something that was beyond his usual state of agitation. There is a man in town, Silas said, asking about us. Josiah set down the fence post he had been carrying and went very still. What kind of man? The kind that carries a badge and a warrant. Name it is Harlan Crane. The name landed in the yard like a stone dropped into a well. Wren, who was sitting on the porch with the account ledger, saw Josiah's face change. It did not harden exactly. It was already hard. But something behind the hardness shifted the way bedrock shifts before an earthquake, invisible on the surface but catastrophic in its implications. Bounty hunter, Josiah said, not a question. Has papers, says they are legal, says he is taking you back to Colorado. Silas's hands were clenched at his sides. I told him he could try. You should not have said that. I said at what needed saying. Emmett appeared in the barn door, having heard the commotion. How long do we have? He is at the hotel in town. Said he would ride out tomorrow morning. Silas looked at Josiah. We can be gone by midnight. Ride north, into Montana. Start over. No, Josiah's voice was quiet, but it carried a finality that silenced the yard. I am not running again. I have run for 3 years. It ends here. Then what? Silas demanded. You let him take you. You let them put you in chains and drag you back to a courtroom where the judge's own son is the one who should be standing trial. I let the law do what the law does, and I trust that the truth will matter. The truth did not matter in Colorado. Colorado was not here. Wren set down the ledger. She stood. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Nobody is running, she said, and nobody is going to Colorado in chains. She looked at Josiah. I need to show you something. She went inside and came back with the family Bible. She sat on the porch steps and opened the back cover and removed the papers she had hidden there for weeks. She spread them on the boards between herself and the 3 brothers, who had become without any of them intending at her family. She told them everything. Her father's past as a lawyer in Colorado, the documents he had gathered, the evidence that someone named Victor Crane, the son of the judge, had been the actual killer in the bank robbery. The affidavits, the letter, and then she said the part that she had been carrying alone for weeks, the part that made her voice shake despite every effort to hold it steady. The bandits who killed my father were not random. They knew he was coming. They knew what he was carrying. Someone sent them. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind moved through the valley, a horse shifted in the corral, and 3 men who had spent their lives learning to survive by controlling their reactions sat perfectly still while the shape of their world rearranged itself around a young woman holding a dead man's papers on a porch in Wyoming. Josiah read the documents. His hands, which could split firewood all day without trembling, shook as he turned the pages. When he finished, he set them down and looked at Wren with an expression she had never seen on his face before. The wall was down, all of it, and behind it was a man who had carried the weight of a false accusation for 3 years and was just now in this moment beginning to believe that he might one day set it down. Your father died for these, he said softly. My father died because he believed that justice was worth protecting, Wren replied, and because he believed your family was worth saving. The next morning, Wren rode into Silver Creek alone. She had argued with all 3 brothers about this. Josiah had wanted to come. Silas had wanted to come with weapons. Emmett had wanted to come with a plan. Wren had overruled them all. Crane is here for Josiah, she said. If Josiah rides into town, Crane has what he wants. If Silas rides in armed, Crane has an excuse to shoot. If we go as a group, we look like what Crane expects. Outlaws circling their wagons. She had looked at each of them. I am going alone because I am the one thing Crane does not expect. A woman. With evidence. And a voice. She found Harlan Crane at the Silver Creek Hotel taking breakfast in the dining room. He was not what she had imagined. He was tall and lean, perhaps 45, with silver-streaked hair, combed back from a face that was more tired than cruel. He wore a dark suit that had seen better days, a silver watch chain across his vest, and a badge pinned to his lapel that identified him as a licensed agent of the Colorado Territorial Court. His eyes were gray and sharp and thoroughly professional. This was not a villain. This was a man doing a bomb, and that Wren realized made him both more dangerous and more persuadable than a villain would have been. Mr. Crane, she said, standing beside his table. He looked up from his eggs. Ma'am, my name is Wren Whitfield. I live at the Hawthorne Ranch. She watched his eyes register the name. I would like to speak with you about Josiah Hawthorne and the warrant you carry for his arrest. Crane set down his fork and studied her with the evaluating gaze of a man who makes his living reading people. Sit down, Miss Whitfield. Wren sat. She placed the documents on the table between them. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She spoke with the measured clarity of a woman who had grown up listening to her father argue cases at the dinner table and had absorbed through years of proximity the architecture of legal reasoning. She told him what the documents contained. She told him about her father, about the journey, about the bandits. She told him about Judge Crane, about Victor Crane, about a system in Colorado that had been corrupted from the bench down. She did not accuse. She did not dramatize. She laid out the facts the way a builder lays out stones one upon another until the wall stood on its own. Harlan Crane read the documents twice. He was a careful man. Whatever sins belonged to the Colorado justice system, this particular agent of it took his work seriously enough to read sworn affidavits with the attention they deserved. These are serious allegations, he said when he finished. They are documented facts, Wren replied, documented by a dead man and witnesses who may or may not still be alive. Then verify them. Write to the federal court in Cheyenne, write to the territorial governor. Take whatever time you need to confirm what those papers say. All I ask is that you do not drag an innocent man back to a courtroom controlled by the family that framed him until you are certain, truly certain, that the warrant you carry is justified. Crane looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the documents again. Then he looked out the window at the main street of Silver Creek, where the morning sun was painting the storefronts gold, and the people of the town were beginning their day with the ordinary concerns of commerce and weather and the price of beef. You love him, Crane said. It was not a question. That is not relevant to the law. No, Crane agreed. But it is relevant to why you are sitting here instead of him. Wren held his gaze without flinching. I am sitting here because the law should serve the truth, not the other way around. And because my father died trying to bring that truth to light. If his death means nothing, then the law means nothing. And I do not believe that, Mr. Crane. I believe you do not believe it either. The silence stretched. The clock on the hotel wall ticked. The dining room filled with the sounds of other people's mornings, uncomplicated by warrants and dead men's papers, and the question of whether justice was a thing that could be found in a place like Wyoming or whether it had been lost somewhere back in Colorado and was never coming back. I will need a week, Crane said finally, to verify. Take as long as you need, Wren said. She stood. She left the copies on the table because the originals were hidden in a place only she knew, sewn back into the Bible cover with threads she had taken from her mending kit. Her father had taught her that a good lawyer always keeps the original separate from the working copy, and the habit had served her well. She walked out of the hotel and into the sunlight. Her hands were shaking. She clasped them together at her waist and walked to the general store because she needed to buy flour and because she needed something ordinary to do before the trembling stopped. She was measuring flour into a paper sack when the store door opened and Sheriff Amos Beckett walked in. He looked at her with an expression that suggested he already knew where she had been and what she had done. You talked to Crane, he said. I did. Alone. Yes. The sheriff shook his head slowly, but the look on his face was not disapproval. It was something closer to admiration, the reluctant kind, the kind a man feels when he watches someone do a thing he wanted to do himself, but did not have the courage for. Your father was a brave man, Beckett said. I see where you got it. The week that followed was the longest of Wren's life. Crane remained in Silver Creek, writing letters, sending telegrams, waiting for responses from Cheyenne and Denver, and eventually Colorado. He did not ride out to the Hawthorne Ranch. He did not attempt to arrest Josiah. He sat in the hotel and did his work and waited, which was in its own way a form of mercy. On the ranch, the waiting settled over the household like a weather system. Josiah worked longer hours, driving himself through the days with a ferocity that worried everyone. He mended every fence on the property. He cleared a drainage ditch that had been clogged since spring. He split enough wood to last 2 winters. He did these things because his hands needed occupation and because the alternative was to sit still and think about what was coming, and thinking was a luxury he could not afford. Wren found him one evening at the corral, leaning on the top rail and watching the horses in the fading light. She walked up beside him and leaned on the same rail. They stood like that for a long time without speaking close enough that their shoulders almost touched, watching the sky turn from gold to copper to the deep blue that preceded the stars. If Crane takes me, Josiah said, and his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with shouting or dust, the ranch stays with Emmett and Silas. The deed is in all three names. They can run it. He is not going to take you. If he does, I need you to know that there is a letter in the strongbox under my bed. It gives you a share of the ranch, equal to my brother's. Wren turned to look at him. His profile was cut from the last light like a figure on a coin, sharp and certain and utterly still. When did you write that letter? She asked. The night of the dance. She let that settle. The night of the dance, the night they had waltzed in a lantern-lit barn, and the space between them had become so charged with unspoken feeling that stepping apart had felt like tearing cloth. You wrote me into the ranch, she said, before you even knew if I was staying. Josiah did not look at her. He looked at the horses, at the mountains, at the sky that was now filling with stars, in the vast and careless way that Wyoming skies fill with stars, as if the universe were showing off. I knew, he said simply. Wren reached across the rail and placed her hand over his. His hand was broad and rough beneath hers, scarred across the knuckles, calloused at every point where wood and rope and iron had pressed against skin for years. He went still the way he always went still. When she touched him, a held breath, a pause in the clockwork of his body, as if her touch required his full and undivided attention. You are not going anywhere, Josiah Hawthorne, she said. I did not travel 2,000 miles and bury my father in this ground and learn to cook on a wood stove and survive your brother's temper to lose you to a warrant signed by a corrupt judge. Do you hear me? He turned his hand beneath hers. His fingers closed around her palm. The grip was firm and warm and shaking very slightly in a way that he could not have hidden if he tried. I hear you, he said. They stood at the fence until the stars were fully out, their hands linked on the rail between them, and neither of them spoke again, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said in the language of fingers intertwined and silence shared. The answer came on a Tuesday. Harlan Crane rode up to the Hawthorne Ranch at mid-morning alone, his horse picking its way up the mountain trail with the careful steps of an animal that does not know the terrain. Josiah saw him coming from the barn. Emmett saw him from the kitchen window. Silas, who had been watching the road from the ridge every morning for 7 days, fired a warning shot into the air and came galloping down the slope with a speed that suggested he intended to arrive before the bounty hunter did, preferably between the bounty hunter and his family. Easy, Josiah said, and the word was directed at Silas, not the horses. They assembled on the porch. 3 brothers and a woman from Boston standing on wood that Josiah had cut and Silas had planed and Emmett had nailed. Nell Ashford, who had ridden over at dawn when word reached the Ashford Ranch that a stranger was heading up the mountain, stood at the bottom of the steps with her father's rifle across her saddle and an expression that dared anyone to cause trouble. They looked down at a man on a horse who held their future in a leather satchel strapped to his saddle. Crane dismounted. He removed his hat. He looked up at them and said in a voice that carried the weariness of a man who has spent a week dismantling his own certainties. I received a telegram from the Federal District Court in Cheyenne this morning. Nobody on the porch moved. Judge Crane of Colorado has been under investigation for 6 months. Corruption charges. His son, Victor Crane, has been indicted by a federal grand jury for the murders at the bank in '72. He paused. The warrant for Josiah Hawthorne's arrest has been vacated. The charges are dismissed. The words fell into the mountain air and hung there, real and solid and irreversible. Emmett made a sound that was not quite a word, something between a laugh and a Silas sat down on the porch steps as if his legs had simply decided they were finished holding him up. He put his face in his hands and stayed there. Nell Ashford, who was not a woman given to displays of emotion, wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and pretended she had not. Josiah did not move. He stood perfectly still, and Wren, standing beside him, watched something happen to his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. The hardness did not leave. The lines did not soften. But something behind his eyes, some weight that had been there so long and had become part of his architecture, shifted and settled, and very slowly began to dissolve, like ice breaking on a river in spring, like the first crack of light through clouds after a long storm. Crane reached into his satchel and withdrew the documents Wren had given him. He held them up. These belong to you, Miss Whitfield. Or should I say to the Hawthorne family? Wren descended the steps and took the papers from his hand. Thank you, she said, for being honest. Crane studied her face. Your father gathered that evidence at considerable personal risk. The men who attacked your wagon were almost certainly sent by the Crane family to prevent those documents from reaching Wyoming. He settled his hat back on his head. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Edmund Whitfield was a braver man than most. He mounted his horse, nodded once to the porch, and rode back down the trail toward Silver Creek. They watched him until he was a small, dark shape against the green of the valley floor, and then until he was nothing at all. Josiah stood on the porch for a long time after Crane disappeared. The mountains were sharp against the sky. The cattle moved in the far pasture. The wind carried the smell of pine and grass and the faintest trace of wood smoke from the cabin chimney where the morning fire was still burning. Wren stood beside him. She did not touch him. She did not speak. She simply stood there, the way he had stood beside her father's grave on the day they met, a wall of quiet presence that asked nothing and offered everything. When Josiah finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the wind. I have been carrying that for 3 years. I know. I did not think it would ever come off. I know, he turned to her. His eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before the amber-gone liquid. Bright with something that was not tears but was close enough to their territory that the distinction hardly mattered. I did not ride toward those gunshots for the ranch, he said, and the words came out rough and cracked like a door being opened that has been closed for a very long time. When I came over that ridge and saw the wagon and the dust still settling, I did not do it because it was the right thing. I did it because I saw you behind that wagon with that little gun in your hand and your chin up and your eyes full of fear that you refused to let win. And something in me knew in that moment that I would ride through any distance, face any warrant, or any bullet for the woman I saw in that moment. Wren's breath left her. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a sound. It simply left the way air leaves a room when a door opens to the sky. I love you, Wren Whitfield, Josiah said. I have loved you since that first day, though I had no right to it then, and I am not sure I have earned the right to it now. Wren looked up at the man who towered over her, whose hands could fell trees, and whose voice could quiet horses, and whose heart she now understood had been waiting behind its walls for someone brave enough, or stubborn enough, or lost enough to find the door. You earned it, she said. Every day, every cup of coffee before dawn, every flower on the windowsill, every silence that said more than words. She placed her hand against his chest, feeling the heartbeat beneath her palm, strong and steady, and faster than a man of his composure would want to admit. I love you, Josiah Hawthorne. I fought against it because I was afraid, but I am not afraid anymore. He raised his hand to her face. His fingers, rough and calloused and trembling with the effort of gentleness, brushed her cheek. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has wanted for so long that the having of it seems impossible. May I kiss you, Wren? In answer, she rose on tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. He responded as if he had been holding back a river, and the dam had finally broken his arms, circling her waist, drawing her close. And the kiss was everything the weeks of silence and flowers and almost touches had promised. It tasted of coffee and cold mountain air, and his beard was rough against her skin, and his arms around her were the strongest and the safest place she had ever stood. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. I have wanted to do that since you pointed that derringer at my chest, he murmured. I am glad you waited, Wren whispered. I really might have shot you. Worth the risk. And he kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a declaration. From inside the cabin, through the open window, came the sound of Emmett laughing and Silas saying something that contained the words "about time" in a tone that managed to be both gruff and deeply satisfied. The weeks that followed were the quietest and the fullest Wren had known since childhood. The threat of Crane was gone. The warrant was vacated, and the invisible weight that Josiah had carried for 3 years, the thing that had kept his jaw tight and his eyes guarded and his heart locked behind walls of duty and silence, had finally been set down. It did not transform him into a different man. He was still quiet, still careful, still more comfortable with a fence rail in his hand than a conversation at his lips. But there was a looseness in his shoulders now that had not been there before, A willingness to hold Wren's gaze across the supper table without looking away, a softness that surfaced in the evenings when the four of them sat by the fire and the world outside the cabin walls felt very far away. He still left coffee for her every morning before dawn, but now some mornings she woke early enough to meet him in the kitchen, and they stood together in the gray light with their cups steaming and the day stretching before them like a gift neither of them had expected to receive. They did not rush what was building between them. There was no need. The mountain had its own pace measured in seasons rather than hours, and they had learned to match it. Josiah courted her in the language of a man who had never courted anyone, which is to say he courted her through work. He built a shelf for her, books in the bedroom. He sanded the rough spots on the porch railing where she liked to lean. He found a rocking chair at the Mercantile in Silver Creek and carried it home on horseback, which was a feat of logistics that Emmett said deserved to be recorded in the territorial archives. Wren courted him back in the language she was learning. She mended his shirts before he asked. She kept the account so clean that the ranch turned its best profit in 3 years. She learned to ride well enough that she could join him on the morning rounds, and they rode side by side through the high pastures in a companionable silence that was better than any conversation she had ever had. October brought a chill to the air and the first dusting of frost on the high peaks. The aspens in the valleys turned to gold, and the whole landscape looked as though it had been dipped in honey and left to dry in the sun. Josiah invited Wren to ride with him to the eastern ridge one afternoon, the place he called his thinking spot, the high point from which you could see the entire ranch spread below, and the mountains beyond it rising in blue and white against a sky so vast it made the heart ache. They sat together on a flat rock at the top of the ridge, their horses grazing behind them. The sun was low and the light was golden, and the valley below them was theirs, every fence and field and rooftop. "I found this place my first week here," Josiah said. He spoke slowly the way he always spoke, choosing words the way a carpenter chooses nails. "Used to ride up here and wonder if I would ever stop running, if I would ever find a place that felt like it was mine to keep." "And did you?" Wren asked. "The place was never the problem," he said. He turned to look at her, and the late light caught his face and made the hard lines into something warmer. What was missing was someone to share it with. You cannot build a home alone. You can build a house, but a home requires more than one pair of hands. He reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew a small object. Wren's breath caught as he opened his palm. A ring, simple gold band with a modest diamond that caught the last of the afternoon light and held it. "This was my mother's," Josiah said, and his voice, which could carry across a valley, had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "She gave it to me before she passed. Said to keep it for the woman who made me want to be a better man than I was." He took a breath that she could see cost him something. "That is you, Wren. It has always been you. Even before I knew you existed, I think some part of me was waiting." He did not kneel. He was not a man built for kneeling. He simply sat beside her on the rock, holding the ring in his calloused palm, and asked with his eyes what his voice could barely manage. "Will you marry me, Wren Whitfield? Will you stay on this mountain and build something with me that outlasts us both?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder, strong enough to carry across the valley they would share. "Yes, Josiah Hawthorne, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as though it had been waiting for her hand. He pulled her close and kissed her forehead, and they sat on the ridge until the stars came out, planning the house he would build on this spot, with windows facing east to catch the sunrise, and a porch wide enough for rocking chairs and children in all the years to come. They married 3 weeks before Christmas in the main room of the Hawthorne cabin, with pine boughs on the mantel and candles in every window, and a fire in the stone hearth that Josiah had built with his own hands. The circuit preacher who had ridden up from Silver Creek performed the ceremony, and his voice filled the small room with words that had been spoken over couples since the beginning of time, but that felt in this place, in this moment, as new as the snow that was falling softly outside. Cornelius Ashford walked Wren down the short aisle between the kitchen table and the fireplace because her father could not, and the old rancher's eyes were wet when he placed her hand in Josiah's and said in a voice roughened by emotion, "Edmund would have been proud." Nell stood beside Wren as her witness, wearing a dress for what she later claimed was the first time in 2 years, and managing to look simultaneously uncomfortable and deeply happy. Emmett served as Josiah's best man. He had written a toast that he attempted to deliver but abandoned halfway through when his voice failed him, settling instead for raising his glass and saying simply, "To family. The kind you are born with and the kind you build." Silas stood in the corner with his arms folded and his jaw set, looking exactly like a man who was not going to cry at his brother's wedding and was furious at his own eyes for threatening to betray him. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Silas was the first to step forward and shake Josiah's hand, and the grip he gave was harder and longer than any handshake needed to be, and everything he could not say was in it. The door closed softly behind Josiah and Wren as they walked to the small cabin at the edge of the property that would be their temporary home until the new house was built. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth that Josiah had prepared that morning, and the room smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the beginning of a life that neither of them had dared to imagine 6 months before. When morning came, everything had changed between them, and the change was as natural and as certain as the snow that covered the Wyoming mountains in white. Spring arrived with the force of a revelation. The snow melted, the creeks ran full, calves appeared in the pastures unsteady on new legs, and the wildflowers returned to the meadows in colors that made the winter seem like a rumor someone had started and no one could quite confirm. Construction began on the new house on the eastern ridge where Josiah had proposed. Emmett designed it. Silas built it, cursing at every crooked nail with a fluency that suggested long practice. Josiah supervised and did the heavy framing, lifting beams into place with a strength that still astonished Wren even after months of watching him work. Cornelius Ashford sent two of his ranch hands to help, and Nell came most afternoons with food and opinions, both of which she delivered in generous quantities. The house grew through the summer like a living thing. 4 bedrooms, a study for Wren's books and ledgers, a kitchen with windows facing the mountains, a porch that wrapped around 3 sides wide enough for the rocking chairs that Josiah had promised, and the life that would fill them. Wren ran the ranch's finances with an efficiency that made buyers in Cheyenne sit up and take notice. Josiah ran the land with the same steady hand he had always brought to it, but lighter now, freer, the hand of a man who is no longer working to outrun something, but working to build something worth staying for. In October, on an evening so similar to the one when he had proposed that it felt like the mountain was rhyming with itself, Wren told Josiah that she was carrying their first child. They were sitting on the unfinished porch of the new house, watching the sun paint the valley in colors that had no names when she took his hand and placed it against her belly and said the words that changed the shape of his face in ways that even the dropping of the warrant had not managed. "The baby will come around Christmas," she said. Josiah looked at his hand on her body, then at her face, then at the mountains, and then back at her face as though he needed to check that the world was still there and that this was happening inside it. "A family, he whispered. "Our family," Wren confirmed. He gathered her carefully into his arms, as though she had become something fragile, and she laughed and told him she was pregnant, not made of glass, and he held her tighter and buried his face in her hair and did not say anything else for a very long time, because some things are too large for words and can only be held. Their daughter was born 3 days before Christmas in the new house on the ridge, with snow falling outside the windows and a fire burning in the hearth. Emmett boiled water. Silas rode to Silver Creek for the doctor at a speed that probably broke several laws of physics. Josiah held Wren's hand through every contraction with a grip that she later told him had left bruises, though he maintained that the bruises were from her grip on him. The doctor arrived barely in time. The baby came into the world with a cry that filled the house and stopped every man in it cold. And when the doctor placed the small, red-faced bundle on Wren's chest, Josiah looked at his daughter with an expression that Wren would carry with her for the rest of her days. It was the expression of a man who has been given something he did not know he was missing until the moment it arrived. "She has your eyes," he said, touching the baby's downy head with one trembling finger. "And your stubbornness," Wren replied, because the baby had refused to come for 3 days past when the doctor expected her, which seemed very much like a Hawthorne trait. "What will you call her?" Emmett asked from the doorway, where he and Silas stood shoulder to shoulder, 2 large men trying to see past each other into the room. "Hope," Josiah said, "because that is what she is. Everything we hoped for." "Hope Elizabeth Hawthorne," Wren added. The middle name was for Josiah's mother. Silas looked at the baby, then at Wren, then at the ceiling. "Something in my eye," he announced and left the room. Nobody pointed out that Silas Hawthorne's eyes were red for the rest of the day. The years turned the way years turn in mountain country, marked not by calendars, but by the accumulation of seasons. Spring planting and fall harvest, summer roundups and winter storms. The rhythm of a life measured in honest work and the slow building of something permanent. Wren watched the ranch grow under their shared stewardship. The herd doubled, then tripled. The book she kept became a model of frontier accounting, and buyers from as far as Denver sought out Hawthorne beef by name. Josiah built a second barn and expanded the corrals. Emmett wrote a column for the Silver Creek Gazette about mountain life that became popular enough to attract mail from readers across the territory. Silas, in a development that surprised everyone, including himself, married Nell Ashford after a courtship that consisted primarily of arguments, most of which Nell won. Hope grew from a baby into a child who could ride before she could properly read, and who inherited her mother's blue eyes, her father's quiet certainty, and her Uncle Silas's complete inability to back down from a challenge. She was followed in time by a brother, Edmund, named for the grandfather he would never meet, a boy who had Emmett's gentle nature and Josiah's strong hands, and who preferred books to horses, which Silas considered a personal insult, but tolerated because the boy could also throw a rope with disturbing accuracy. Cornelius Ashford lived long enough to bounce both children on his knee and to tell them stories about the day their mother arrived at the Hawthorne gate in a ruined dress with nothing but a trunk and a determination that could have moved mountains. "Your mama," he told them, "stood up to 3 Hawthorne men and a bounty hunter and did not blink. That is the kind of woman this territory was built by." On the community that had once whispered about the girl from Boston living with 3 mountain men became the community that relied on the Hawthorne family for fair dealing, sound advice, and the annual summer dance that Wren and Nell organized each July in the big barn, which had become a tradition as fixed and reliable as the seasons themselves. There were hard years, a drought that nearly broke them, a winter so savage that they lost a quarter of the herd, and Josiah worked 20-hour days for 6 weeks straight, coming home each night with ice in his beard and exhaustion in his bones. Wren met him at the door on those nights with coffee and warm food and the steady presence that had anchored him since the day she lowered that derringer and let him into her life. "Winter always ends," she told him on the worst night when the wind howled like something alive and the thermometer read 20 below and the loss felt like more than they could bear. He looked at her across the kitchen table. This woman who had crossed a continent and buried her father and faced down a bounty hunter and learned to cook on a wood stove and run a ranch and raise children and love a man who had been convinced he was unlovable. And he said what he always said, what he had been saying in one form or another since the first day they met. "Built this together." His hand found hers across the table. "We will get through this together too." And they did, as they always did, as they always would. 25 years passed. It was the year 1900 and the century had turned, and the Wyoming Territory had become the state of Wyoming, and the world had changed in ways that Edmund Whitfield could never have imagined when he packed his family into a wagon and pointed it west. But some things had not changed. The mountains were still there. The valley was still green in summer and white in winter. And the ranch that Josiah Hawthorne had built with his own hands still stood on the slopes above Silver Creek. Larger now, more prosperous, but still rooted in the same ground and built on the same principles of hard work and honest dealing that had laid its foundation. Josiah Hawthorne sat in a rocking chair on the porch of the house on the ridge, the house he had built for his bride a quarter-century before. He was 57 now, his dark hair gone to iron gray, his face more deeply lined, his movements slower than they had been when he could swing an axe from dawn to dusk without resting. But his eyes were unchanged, still amber, still clear, still capable of seeing straight through whatever wall a person put up to the truth that lived behind it. Wren sat beside him. She was 46, her honey blonde hair threaded with silver, her face bearing the lines that come from years of sun and wind and laughter and the particular kind of beauty that belongs to women who have lived fully and without apology. She was still small. She still fit perfectly under his arm when he pulled her close, which he did often, because Josiah Hawthorne had spent the first 32 years of his life not touching anyone and intended to spend the remaining years making up for it. Below them in the yard that spread between the main house and the original cabin, which had been converted into a library and guest quarters, the evidence of a life well built, moved and breathed and made noise. Hope, 24 now, in the image of her mother, chased her own daughter across the grass while her husband, a rancher's son from the next valley, pushed a baby carriage and pretended not to notice that the 3-year-old had escaped again. Young Edmund, 22, sat on the porch of the old cabin with a book in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, reading aloud to Nell's oldest boy, who listened with the rapt attention of a child who has discovered that stories are better than chores. Silas emerged from the barn with the bow-legged stride of a man whose knees had been arguing with the rest of his body for at least a decade. His auburn hair was mostly gone, now replaced by a sunburned scalp that he protected with a hat he refused to take off even at the dinner table, which drove Nell to a fury that was, after 15 years of marriage, more theatrical than genuine. He spotted his nephew reading instead of working and bellowed across the yard, "I have told you 100 times, saddle the horse before you sit down with a book." Emmett was in the kitchen of the main house cooking Sunday dinner for the entire extended family, which now numbered 14 and showed no signs of stopping. His chestnut hair had gone silver at the temples, and he still hummed Missouri folk songs while he worked, and the food he produced was still the best in 3 counties, a fact he mentioned at least once per meal. Caleb, Emmett's own son, a boy of 12 with his father's green eyes and his Uncle Josiah's height, was setting the long table that now stretched across the dining room, counting plates with the serious concentration of a child who has been trusted with an important job and intends to do it right. Wren watched all of this from the porch. The grandchildren, the brothers, the spouses, and the children, and the wives and the horses, and the ongoing, relentless, beautiful chaos of a family that had grown from 3 lonely men on a mountain and a girl from Boston with a derringer and a trunk. "Josiah," she said, "do you remember the first day?" He did not need to ask which first day. There was only one. "Every morning," he said, "I pointed a gun at your chest. That little derringer could not have hit the broadside of a barn. I could too. I hit the tin can in Missouri. Once out of 6. Once was enough," she smiled. The smile she had been giving him for 25 years, the one that started in her eyes and moved to her mouth and made him feel every single time as though the sun had come out after a storm he had forgotten was raining. "I said I did not know you," she murmured. Josiah turned to look at his wife, his eyes still warm, still steady, still the eyes of the man who had dug her father's grave and given away his only blanket, and left wildflowers on a windowsill every morning for 2 months before he could bring himself to say what the flowers meant. He reached for her hand. His fingers, roughened by decades of labor, closed around hers with the same careful firmness they had held on a porch railing in the starlight on a night when neither of them knew what the future held. "And I said you did not have to. Yet." "Yet," Wren repeated. She leaned her head against his shoulder the way she had leaned against his back on that chestnut stallion a lifetime ago, when the prairie was warm and empty and the only thing standing between her and the dark was a stranger who smelled of wood smoke and turned earth. "Now I know," she said softly. "Everything. The strength and the silence and the stubbornness and the gentleness. All of it, and I would not trade a single moment." "Not even the stew?" he asked. Because Josiah Hawthorne, who spoke less in a week than most men spoke in a day, had somewhere along the way developed a sense of humor that surfaced at exactly the right moments, like water finding its way through rock. Wren laughed. The sound carried across the yard and reached the ears of their daughter, who looked up and saw her parents on the porch holding hands in the autumn light, the way they had held hands for as long as Hope could remember. And she smiled, because some things in this world are as reliable as the mountains and as enduring as the stone they are made of, and the love between Josiah and Wren Hawthorne was one of those things. "Not even the stew," Wren confirmed. They sat on the porch as the sun descended behind the peaks and the valley filled with the long blue shadows of evening. The sounds of family drifted up from below, Emmett calling everyone to dinner, Silas arguing with his wife about the hat, children laughing, a screen door banging, the ordinary, irreplaceable music of a life that had been built from nothing by people who refused to give up on each other. Wren Hawthorne remembered stepping off a stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting, no house in sight, just 3 bearded mountain men and 100 miles of wilderness. The letter had promised a home, The letter had not told her the half of it, because the home she found was not the cabin or the ranch or the house on the ridge with its windows facing east. The home she found was a man who dug graves for strangers and talked to his horse at night and left wildflowers where he thought no one would know. It was his brother's one who wrote letters full of someone else's love, and one who showed his heart through acts of service he would deny until the day he died. It was a community that took her in, and a mountain that tested on her, and a life that asked everything of her and gave back more than she ever thought to ask for. She looked out over the land they had built together. Every fence, every field, every stone and every wall, 25 years of mornings and evenings, of blizzards survived and calves born and children raised and arguments settled and silences shared. Of a love that did not begin with a kiss or a declaration, but with a simple act of decency on a dusty road, a stranger burying a dead man he did not know because it was the right thing to do. The first star appeared in the darkening sky above the mountains, bright and steady and alone. "You are home now," Josiah said, the way he said it every evening, the way he had been saying it for 25 years, as though the words were not a statement, but a prayer, not a fact, but a vow renewed each day against the possibility that the world might try to take it back. Wren squeezed his hand, the hand that had built this ranch, that had held hers through labor and loss and every season between, that had never once let go. "I have been home," she said, "since the day you told me I did not have to know you. Yet." The star brightened. Others followed. And on a porch in Wyoming, on a mountain that had watched three brothers build a life and a woman from Boston find a family, two people held each other's hands and watched the sky fill up with light and knew that what they had built together was strong enough to outlast the stars themselves.